One morning, I found a bright red violation notice slapped onto my windshield. The reason? My car was too old for the neighborhood. But what the HOA didn't know, it was a rare collector's gem, worth more than some of their luxury SUVs. For years, my quiet suburban neighborhood had been a peaceful place to live, until the HOA decided to shake things up. Out of nowhere, they introduced a new rule. Any vehicle over 10 years old was now deemed unsightly and had to be removed or face daily fines. At first, I thought it was a joke. My car, a pristine 1972 Pontiac Firebird, was hardly an eyesore. In fact, it was a meticulously maintained collector's piece. But the HOA wasn't interested in details. The first violation notice arrived with a $50 fine, stapled to a vague warning about community aesthetics. I figured a quick conversation would clear things up. But when I called the HOA president, a man who had always seemed to relish enforcing rules, he dismissed me outright. Rules are rules, he said, and just like that, a simple parking dispute turned into a battle I never saw coming. I thought the first fine was just a misunderstanding, something that could be resolved with a little reasoning. But I was wrong. A week later, another notice arrived, this time with a doubled fine. Then came another, and another. The HOA wasn't backing down. In fact, they were escalating. I attended a board meeting hoping to plead my case. I laid out my argument, explaining that my car wasn't abandoned or in disrepair. It was a well-preserved classic, registered and insured, parked neatly in my own driveway. But the HOA president barely let me finish before waving a hand dismissively. The rule applies to all vehicles over 10 years old, he said. No exceptions. When I pushed back, pointing out that several other homes had decade-old cars parked outside, he smirked. We're addressing violations as we see fit. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about community aesthetics, it was targeted. And I wasn't the only one. Neighbors began whispering about similar fines appearing on their doors, but only for select residents. One family had been cited for a basketball hoop in their driveway, another for overgrown grass that was barely an inch higher than their neighbors. Yet, the board ignored obvious violations from their own inner circle. When I formally appealed the fines, my request was rejected without explanation. That's when things turned hostile. The HOA threatened to tow my car at my expense. They even sent a letter suggesting that if I didn't comply, I could face legal action. Or worse, a lien on my home. What started as a simple fine had snowballed into a full-blown battle, and I knew I had to fight back before they bulldozed over me completely. It wasn't long before I realized that determination alone wouldn't turn the tide. I needed irrefutable evidence. I dove headfirst into the HOA's archives, sifting through old board meeting minutes, forgotten memos, and even dusty property records. Late into many sleepless nights, I uncovered a disturbing pattern. Every harsh rule had a hidden loophole. Every penalty a secret exception that benefited a select few. I discovered that the same attorney who penned our current parking regulation had a notorious history of defending similar dubious practices in other communities. With each document, the picture grew clearer: a systematic abuse of power, masked by legal jargon and selective enforcement. Armed with this damning evidence, I meticulously compiled a dossier cross-referencing dates, names, and even audio recordings from board meetings where dissenting voices were quickly hushed. I reached out to other residents who had been unfairly targeted, and their stories echoed mine. Together, we formed an informal alliance, a band of determined homeowners armed with truth. I shared my findings on local forums, and what started as isolated fines quickly turned into a community-wide outcry. This was the turning point. We transformed from passive victims into active challengers of a corrupt system. The evidence wasn't just a collection of documents, it was the catalyst that galvanized us all to fight back, proving that when truth is unearthed, even the most oppressive regimes can be confronted head-on. The legal battle that ensued was nothing short of a high-stakes showdown that rattled the very foundation of our seemingly placid community. With every shred of evidence in hand, I stepped into the courtroom, a reluctant warrior armed with documents, recordings, and the testimonies of fellow residents. From the outset, the case was framed as a classic David versus Goliath narrative, with the HOA, a monolithic institution with deep roots and even deeper pockets, taking on a determined homeowner and his band of disaffected neighbors. The first hearing was a blur of fast-paced legal arguments and rapid-fire exchanges between attorneys. The HOA's lawyer, slick and confident, argued that the parking regulation was a necessary measure to uphold community standards and property values. He claimed that our evidence was nothing more than isolated complaints without merit. But as I began to present our dossier, a collection of board meeting minutes, emails, and recorded conversations, there was a palpable shift in the room. The judge leaned forward, eyebrows raised, as the evidence painted a picture of systemic bias and arbitrary enforcement. It became evident that the rule was not applied uniformly, but rather selectively, targeting those who dared to question the board's authority. During the trial, every day brought a new twist. One morning, as the media flocked outside the courthouse, I could hear snippets of commentary. A landmark case against HOA tyranny. And could this be the beginning of a new era for homeowner rights? The press conferences that followed each hearing were charged with raw energy, as local journalists demanded accountability from the board. Public sentiment quickly turned in our favor, and soon testimonials from outraged residents flooded in, bolstering our case with personal stories of injustice. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. The prosecution's arguments were met with our relentless cross-examination, where we meticulously dismantled every claim of procedural propriety by the HOA. I recalled one particularly intense session where the board's decision-making process was laid bare. A series of closed-door meetings, undocumented votes, and backroom deals that clearly violated principles of transparency. The judge's questions grew more pointed, his tone more skeptical of the HOA's narrative. Meanwhile, our legal team worked tirelessly behind the scenes, uncovering additional records that further undermined the board's credibility. The turning point came during a dramatic day in court when a key witness, a former board member who had resigned under mysterious circumstances, took the stand. With a calm yet resolute demeanor, she recounted how decisions were made behind closed doors, with influential residents often given preferential treatment. Her testimony not only corroborated our claims but also exposed the tangled web of conflicts of interest that had long plagued the HOA. As her words resonated through the courtroom, the tension was almost tangible. Both sides recognized that this revelation could tip the scales irrevocably. Outside, the community rallied like never before. Social media exploded with hashtags like #HODIRANI and #JusticeForHomeowners. News channels ran special segments dissecting every detail of the case, and local opinion pieces questioned the integrity of the very institution that was supposed to safeguard our neighborhood. The pressure mounted on the HOA, whose board members were now portrayed as oppressors rather than stewards. Their once unassailable image was rapidly crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny and legal evidence. In a series of grueling courtroom sessions, legal maneuvering became a high-octane game of chess. Every new piece of evidence was met with counter-arguments, and every legal technicality was scrutinized to its core. Our attorney, a seasoned litigator, known for taking on powerful adversaries, delivered a masterful closing argument that left the jury visibly moved. He spoke of fairness, accountability, and the fundamental rights of every homeowner to enjoy their property without fear of arbitrary fines and punitive regulations. His words painted a vivid picture of a community reclaiming its voice against a shadowy and overreaching bureaucracy. The climax of the trial arrived when the judge, after a long and tense deliberation, finally delivered his verdict. In that moment, time seemed to slow as every attendee in the courtroom held their breath. The ruling was a resounding victory for us, a declaration that the HOA's actions were not only unjust, but had breached legal standards of fairness and transparency. The courtroom erupted in a mix of relief and jubilation. For many, it was a long overdue reckoning with a system that had long operated in secrecy. Yet, the aftermath of the verdict was as dramatic as the trial itself. The media continued to swarm the courthouse, and public officials began to call for sweeping reforms in how HOAs were governed. A town hall meeting was convened shortly after, where residents, emboldened by our victory, demanded accountability and transparency from their community leaders. I found myself at the center of a grassroots movement that was rapidly gaining momentum. The legal battle had evolved into a broader struggle for justice, sparking debates on homeowner rights and the limits of HOA power across the region. Throughout this entire ordeal, the experience was both harrowing and exhilarating. Every courtroom session, every press conference, and every conversation with a supportive neighbor reinforced the belief that no system, no matter how entrenched, is above the law. The relentless pursuit of truth, even in the face of overwhelming opposition, became a rallying cry for change. Our victory was not just about a single fine or an outdated car. It was a triumph over a deeply flawed system that had allowed unchecked authority to run rampant. As the case drew to a close, the ripple effects began to be felt throughout our community. The HOA was forced to implement immediate reforms, including transparent decision-making processes and clearer, more equitable rules that were open to community input. What had started as a personal battle had ignited a movement that promised to reshape our neighborhood for the better. Standing in that courtroom, watching the scales of justice finally balance, I realized that sometimes a single act of defiance is all it takes to spark a revolution. And in that pivotal moment, with the gavel echoing in the background and the sound of applause rising from the gallery, I knew that our fight had become a beacon of hope for homeowners everywhere. When the dust finally settled after the courtroom drama, the resolution felt both monumental and deeply personal. In the wake of the judge's resounding verdict, our once divided community found itself united in a celebration of justice and reform. The HOA, which had long operated behind a veneer of bureaucratic authority and selective enforcement, was forced to confront its own shortcomings. In a swift aftermath, a series of emergency board meetings were convened, and the old guard was replaced by a group of community-elected members committed to transparency and fairness. The reforms were radical. Every decision would henceforth be made in open meetings, and every homeowner was granted the right to access board documents and records. The very fabric of our neighborhood governance was rewoven to ensure that power would no longer be concentrated in the hands of a few, but distributed equitably among all residents. As I walked through our community in the days following the verdict, I noticed subtle but profound changes. Neighbors who had once exchanged wary glances now stopped to chat with a sense of renewed camaraderie. The tension that had gripped our streets was gradually replaced by an air of cautious optimism. Homeowners began to share their stories of past grievances, and those who had suffered in silence found solace in the collective voice of the community. I spent many evenings at town hall meetings where the focus was no longer on punitive measures, but on constructive dialogue, accountability, and genuine progress. The experience had taught us all that when citizens band together and insist on transparency, even the most entrenched systems can be challenged and reformed. Reflecting on the journey, I realized that this battle was about more than just finance or an old car. It was a fight for the right to be heard and respected. The legal victory, while sweet, was only part of a larger transformation that had begun to ripple through every corner of our neighborhood. The HOA's drastic overhaul wasn't merely a reaction to a single court ruling. It was an acknowledgement that power, when unchecked, can undermine the very spirit of community. The reforms became a symbol of our collective ability to hold institutions accountable, and they set a precedent that rippled far beyond our streets. Other communities began to take note, with several neighboring HOAs reviewing their own practices in hopes of avoiding a similar public backlash. In private moments, I found myself pondering the broader implications of our victory. It was a reminder that change often comes at a high cost, and that standing up against established authority can be both isolating and empowering. I recalled the sleepless nights spent poring over documents and the nerve-wracking days in court, and I felt a deep gratitude for the unity that emerged from adversity. There was a palpable sense that our struggle had not only redefined local governance, but had also rekindled a belief in the power of community advocacy. It reaffirmed my conviction that every voice matters, and that even a single act of defiance can spark a revolution if it resonates with the collective will for change. The ruling was heralded by local media as a landmark decision that would forever alter the landscape of homeowner rights. Headlines lauded the verdict and a victory for the little guy and a blow to bureaucratic overreach. Public forums, Online discussion boards and neighborhood gatherings buzz with excitement and hope. I was invited to speak at several community events where I shared my experience and encouraged others to never underestimate the power of persistence and informed advocacy. My story became a beacon for those who had long felt powerless against the opaque machinations of large organizations. Yet amidst the celebrations, I remained mindful of the delicate balance between order and liberty. I recognize that while the reforms promised a more just system, the underlying issues of governance and accountability would require constant vigilance. The transformation of the HOA was not a final destination, but rather a new beginning, a call for ongoing engagement from every resident. I spent time organizing workshops on homeowner rights and legal literacy, determined to ensure that the community would never again be caught off guard by arbitrary decisions. These sessions were attended by people from all walks of life, united by a shared resolve to build a community that was as transparent as it was inclusive. In those reflective moments, I couldn't help but think back to the days when the threat of towing and mounting fines had loomed over my head, when the old rules had seemed insurmountable and the board's decisions inflexible. Now, every conversation, every public hearing, and every vote was a testament to the power of collective action. The court's decision had not only vindicated me, but had also sparked a cultural shift, a move towards a more engaged and informed citizenry that demanded fairness in every aspect of community life. The impact of our battle extended beyond the immediate victory. Local government officials began to scrutinize the operations of HOAs across the region, and proposals for new legislation aimed at protecting homeowner rights gained traction. Our case was cited in discussions about regulatory reform and even became a case study in local law schools. The legacy of that trial was evident in the changing attitudes towards community governance, a transformation that had begun with a single challenge and blossomed into a comprehensive rethinking of how communities should be managed. Standing at the crossroads of that change, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment mixed with a sober understanding of the responsibilities that came with it. The victory had been hard won, and the reforms, while promising, required continued effort to sustain. It was a stark reminder that freedom and justice are not static. They must be continuously defended and nurtured through active participation and vigilance. In the end, my journey from being fined for owning an old car to becoming a catalyst for reform was a testament to the enduring power of truth and solidarity. The courtroom had not only delivered a verdict, but had also sown the seeds for a more democratic and transparent community. My vintage car, once seen as an outdated relic, had become a symbol of resistance and resilience, a reminder that sometimes the most unlikely battles can lead to the most transformative victories. As I look around at a community now empowered by its newfound voice, I realize that this experience has reshaped not just policies and practices, but also the way we perceive our roles as citizens. It was a victory that resonated in every conversation, every reform, and every hopeful smile shared on our streets, marking the beginning of a legacy that would inspire future generations to stand up, speak out, and reclaim their rights. In the end, my fight wasn't just about an old car or a fine. It was a rallying cry for every homeowner who's ever felt powerless. I learned that one person, armed with determination and truth, can ignite change in an unjust system. This journey showed me that when we unite and demand transparency, even the strictest rules can be challenged and reformed. Our story is a powerful reminder that each voice matters, and that with persistence and knowledge, we can turn injustice on its head and reclaim our community's dignity. Thank you for joining me on this journey from injustice to empowerment. If this story of standing up to unfair rules resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more real-life tales of resilience. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you're always in the loop with our weekly updates on community triumphs. I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever faced a similar challenge in your neighborhood? Drop your story in the comments below and join the conversation. Your voice is crucial in sparking change, and together we can challenge any system.